anthology of populisms in Latin America could be useful for helping us understand what was emerging in this country and how it was going to affect our daily lives. Since the seminar focuses on gender and state formation, the link between gender and populisms became the lens through which we started to make sense of the way in which masculinities and femininities were being shaped as subjectivities, as dimensions of identity, and as unacknowledged political logics that gave form to the relationship between leaders and people, to the notions of production and social reproductions that were being deployed, and the meanings of nation and nationalism in the era of global capitalism. Conversations with my dear colleague Amy Huras, whose research focus is on education, language, and power in colonial Latin America, led us to the decision to focus on the language dimension of the link between gender and populism. Populist political mobilization has been characterized by strong rhetorical appeals by populist leaders to the people and a frequent and immediate style of communication. Thus, unpacking the role of language as a resource and a legitimation tool became crucial. We hope that this conference will add complexity and nuance to the notion of populisms by analyzing it through the lens of gender and language. To do so, we have brought scholars of Latin America's historic and current populisms into dialogue with experts of contemporary processes in North America and beyond. We also intend for our students, present and future, to learn from and participate in this discussion. To this end, we have created a website where they will be able to participate through blog posts and debate, through gathering and uploading materials to create an online syllabus related to our discussion today. Video footage of the conference will also be uploaded to the website. In addition to thanking all of our students, we'd like to give a special warm thank you to Michael Carey, a CLACS alum. Michael has been with us, has been involved in every aspect of the planning of this conference, from the writing of proposals, selecting and contacting speakers, organizing travel, and planning the online component of the conference. Thanks as well to Vladimir Peñalosa, who's also alum and who designed our conference website, and who, along with Adi Ramirez, an actual student now, pushed us to seriously analyze and clarify what we meant by populism. And to Melissa Gasparotto, another CLACS alum who is organizing the syllabus component of the website. To Isabel, Hazel, and Belle De Stefani for the logistical support, which is the basis of for our endeavor. We also want to thank Jill Lane and Omar Dauharje for trusting us and encouraging us to take all of our discussions about populism inside the classroom and out, and turning them into a conference, gathering the finest of scholars on this topic. Thank you. And I present now to Amy, who's going to introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Pamela. I just want to reiterate the thanks that Pamela has given to our esteemed guests, and it's my honor to present them now. Federico Finkelstein is a professor of history at the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lang College. He is the author of 5 books on fascism, populism, dirty wars, the Holocaust, and Jewish history in Latin America and Europe. His new book is From Fascism to Populism in a History, published by the University of California Press in September 2017. Federico will be moderating what we hope will be a dialogue between our 3 speakers. Sahar Abi Hassan is a PhD candidate at Boston University. Her research focuses on the impact of institutional dynamics and discursive interactions on the formation of political attitudes and behavior. Her interests include political institutions and political behavior, political analysis, and quantitative political methodology. She is currently working on a project that examines the role of U.S. interest groups in influencing judicial processes and behavior on the U.S. Supreme Court. and another project that explores the role of political trust in the emergence of radical political attitudes. Sarah Ferris, who is, because of health reasons, unable to be with us in person today, but who will be joining us by video, is a senior lecturer of sociology at Goldsmiths University of London. Her work to date has focused on the Orientalist underpinnings of sociological theory and on theories of gender, race, and social reproduction, particularly as they apply to the analysis of migrant women in Western Europe. Her publications include Max Weber's Theory of Personality, Individualism, Politics, and Orientalism in the Sociology of Religion, published in 2013, and In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Phenomenationalism in 2017. And finally, Carlos de la Torre is professor of sociology at the University of Kentucky. He has a PhD from the New School for Social Research, and he has been a fellow at the Simon Guggenheim Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. He is the author of several books on populism, published both in English and Spanish. These include the Routledge International Handbook of Global Populism, forthcoming in 2018, The Promise and Perils of Populism, published in 2015, Latin American Populism of the 21st Century, co-edited with Cynthia Arnson in 2013, and Populist Seductions in Latin America, the second edition of which was published in 2010. Thank you again to all of you, and I'll hand it over to Federico.
Thank you very much. Well, myself, I would like to thank Pamela, Amy, and Michael for inviting me to be here. I mean, it's generally, many times it happens that in order to go to a wonderful conference, one needs to travel a lot, and in this case, I just walk 5 blocks, so even better. and again, it's great to be here with Carlos and Sahar on the same table. I mean, Carlos, I can say that a lot of what I know about populism, I started learning from Carlos' work, and Sahar, I just read recently, her essay on gender and populism, and again, it was an opportunity for learning a lot. So, as I said, in this table, I'm here also as a learner and a student of the people that are on the table, and I will make a kind of introduction on what, on what or how I regard this issue of populism, in order then to give them the opportunity to grapple with this issue, which in my view is a key issue. It doesn't need to be demonstrated, and yet it is demonstrated almost every day that we see this phenomenon, which myself I call macho populism, again and again, and rather than being a kind of lateral issue or a kind of idiosyncratic element in the personality of the current populist caudillo at the White House, it is, I will argue, an issue that he shares with many others, and yet, and then we might want to think it as a kind of pattern of what populism has been in history and where it is and where it might be going. In other words, this issue that the conference put forward, which is the idea of having what are the kind of lessons that we can learn from the study of populism. And this is something that I have been, that every day I'm surprised, sometimes gladly surprised about the emergence of new studies on populism, but also I am rather surprised as well by the fact that these new studies often ignore the kind of work that people like us have been doing for some time, because this is not a new issue. It might be a new issue for those that always disregarded, let's say, the key links that always existed between the US and the rest. And for us, particularly for Latin Americans, this is not, it's not with Trump or Trumpism that we see many relations with things that actually we are very critical of in Latin America, and we're always here in the US, but perhaps now even those that wanted to deny, how, let's say, either how American Latin America is or how Latin America and the US is, in other words, how these things are connected and ideas of North and South should be really problematized. And that's what, in my case, history does. Studying history allows you to see how complex it is, and how things that look underdeveloped might be happening all over the place, and there is an actual connection between them, which history and other social sciences can explain. In the case of the studies of populism, actually people that like us that have been studying Latin American history or Latin American phenomena, including populism, we were, of course, perhaps surprised as citizens like everybody else by the triumph of Trumpism in the election. I will not consider myself as one of those that now say, and all these people that kind of blossom after the election, never heard him before, but many people say, I knew he was going to win. Well, I will not say that. Actually, in fact, I can say that having studied populism for almost 20 years, that really did not qualify me to see the future, and I actually didn't think that Trump was going to win. Now, he won. And in fact, that makes even a further connection between the study of the US and the study of Latin America, particularly regarding populism. Because if there is something in Latin America we had for a long time was populist regimes, populist governments, and this is the first actually in the US at the federal level. And again, I mean, there are patterns here that we might want to connect. The issue of the relationship between gender and populism is one of those patterns. I mean, in my own book, which is, this one, I brought the thing. After studying all these cases of populism in history, and actually after denouncing even, or being actually very critical of ideal, typical, or Platonic definitions of populism that kill the complexity in the thing and kill the history in the thing, myself, I came up with a couple of patterns that I saw in all these histories. I will read them because I think, it will be nice to provide the audience at least with an idea of what, someone like me, but also I agree with others on this, will consider populism to be. Because populism, as you know, is a term that has been used and also abused. It's a term that is always presented as an insult rather than a kind of concept that can explain things. Or sometimes it's presented as a good thing. Being populist in America at some point before Trump meant being with the people or closer to popular demands, even to the extent that President Obama at one point said, I'm a populist. And someone like Steve Bannon will say, no, you are not, I am the populist, and so on and so forth. But then what do they mean by this? And again, I will just read this brief list in order to arrive at the point that I want to make about the relationship between gender and populism. So I will say that populism involves an attachment to an authoritarian, electoral, anti-liberal democracy that practically rejects dictatorship, meaning populism is a form of democracy. It might be authoritarian, actually it is authoritarian, but it's not a dictatorship. And I always tell my students, look, when I was young, I lived under a dictatorship, and I see the distinctions between, that thing and this thing. And even if it sounds like it, it's not. And even the fact that we are having these conversations, I think, proves my point. We will not have this conversation, for example, in dirty war Argentina. We will be all arrested, probably. The second thing is an extreme form of political religion. If politics also involves this kind of moment in which secular things eventually take the form or the shape of religious things. Populism is that, but it takes that to an extreme. It involves also an apocalyptic vision of politics that presents electoral success and the transformations those transitory electoral victories enable, meaning you just won an election, right? You don't have really a mandate. You're supposed to represent someone or something. But they present this as revolutionary moments in the foundation or refoundation of society. It involves a political theology founded by a messianic and charismatic leader of the people. It considers political antagonists as the anti-people, namely as enemies of the people and traitors to the nation. And I was telling Carlos, we were talking about Correa, and in an interview that they made to Correa in Argentina, they asked him about his political adversaries, and in a moment of, I guess he was, this is typical, but he was, engaging in hyperbole in order to push it, even forward. He said, well, our political adversaries. Actually, this is a battle of life and death, and actually they are enemies. They are not adversaries, they are enemies. So this idea of the enemy is central. Then it involves, as you know, a weak understanding of the rule of law and the separation of powers, a radical nationalism, a notion of the leader as the personification of the people, an identification of movements and leaders with the people as a whole, meaning the leader and the people that voted for that leader are actually or are presented as the people at large. So in fact, for example, in this country, the electoral minority that voted for the president are suddenly presented as the American people. What about the others? Let's go back to the previous pattern, which is the others are enemies. The best way in which they could be understood is as idiots, that they don't know what is good for them. The worst part could be that they are traitors to the nation. So either idiots or traitors. The claim of anti-politics, which in practice means transcending politics as usual, meaning doing politics in a different way. This claim that I'm not a politician. Even President Trump at one point, he said in a weird moment of almost self-reflection, he said, well, I guess now I'm kind of doing politics, or I'm a politician, I guess. But, and this is important, the act of speaking in the name of the people and against the ruling elites. You might recall, for example, in the convention, in the Republican convention, I am the voice of the people. The guy said, I speak for those without a voice. So this is interesting because in terms of discourse, which is a key issue of the conference, that is key. There is this idea that not only you speak in the name of the people, but you ascribe those people, you take their voice. When you do that. These people are not supposed to speak because I speak for them. They are the voiceless citizens. Then a self-presentation of it standing for true democracy and against imagined or real forms of dictatorship and tyranny. This is very interesting because a dictatorship is a dictatorship. But these guys say that they are defending democracy against either real or imagined dictatorships. Could be real dictatorships, as in many cases of Peronism in history, but also imagined dictatorships of tyranny, such as the European Union, globalization, or even the deep state. A homogenizing idea of the people as a single entity, this is important. The people are one, it's only one people. And when populism becomes a regime, this single entity is then equated with its electoral majorities. Minorities in the case of the US, in other historical cases, majorities, electoral majorities. But 51%, 43%, whatever. A deep antagonism and even aversion to independent journalism, two more. A dislike for, I promise two more and that's it, a dislike for pluralism and political tolerance, and a stress on popular culture, and even in many cases, on the world of entertainment as embodiments of national traditions. So you see a show like The Apprentice, this is what the people want, this is what the people are. The other stuff is intellectual stuff that does not represent the nation. Now, this is, I read a lot of books. It was a pleasure to do. I studied many histories and I came up with these patterns that I found. And yet, you might say, did I mention gender? Actually, I didn't. So I was studying this because actually, in fact, the book ends with a section which is called macho populism. Now, this pattern I couldn't find in all the cases, so I did not include it in this kind of a historical take on populism. And yet, as I dedicated the last section of the book to this issue, I believe it's central, and it's central to many cases. And this involves two distinctions, I will say. Do I have 5 more minutes, something like that? Okay. So this involves two distinctions. And coming from where I come, which is Argentina, and also having studied fascism before populism, I'm certainly biased. So I deal with one of them in particular, which is the populist construction of masculinity. The other one, as other colleagues in the table will deal with, is equally important because it's this idea, even this idea, in the same way that populism pretends to be at the side of democracy against dictatorship or against tyranny, in many cases, actually, it, as we see, in the work of Sarah Farris, it also actually involves the notion that it defends women against a certain men, but that notion itself is rooted, as she says, and I agree, in notions of, in all notions of empire and masculinity. I would add to that mixed fascism, which also had a particular construction of masculinity. And then, I was thinking, when was the time, and this is really, incredible given the fact that Carlos is sitting next to me, but when was the time that I first read about this? And it was when I read Carlos' book, which originally was published in 2002. in 2000, because I mean his analysis of people like Bucaram, for example, I mean his insistence, and almost his obsession on genitalia as a way to describe politics. I mean, this idea that, basically there is a certain type of let's say, proper male genitalia that is presented by him, and then the idea is that the others, they do not have the right, the right type of, basically present this abnormal masculinity, or even female bodies. Again, this is typical in the study of fascism, and is really understudied in populism. And it was with Carlos' work that I first was surprised about this. And then I started studying other cases, like Menem, for example, in Argentina. And he was kind of in the same. And then Berlusconi in Italy. And then, of course, Donald J. Trump. I mean, so basically, when you have a candidate that in the campaign makes a key point about the fact that he has the right type of genitalia, or the fact that he, he represents this masculinity that all American males will identify with. I mean, this is not idiosyncratic. This has been said before by many others. And yet, as Sahar notes in her very important article, I mean, it's a formidable state of the question. I think, this has been understudied. I mean, we don't have much on this, and we need to know much more about this. And certainly in many cases, because it becomes a very complex issue in itself. Now, even to the extent that it is these populisms, and especially in Latin America, and especially in my country, that also they have a particular politics of gender that at the same time that they dismiss, and I'm talking about Peronism, at the same time that they dismiss feminism. I mean, if you read Eva Perón's, famous works, I mean, she actually is against feminism. And basically she says at one point, the place of women is at home. But and their role should be that of raising, producing and raising kids, and basically that is coming from the mouth of someone who has decided not to have kids, and actually he's number 2 in the policies of Argentina, and has an incredible political role. And I will even go further. I would say, at the time that she's doing politics, I don't think there is a single female politician in the entire world that has the power to do things that she has. And then in the 1970s. We have the first female Argentine president, which was not Cristina Kirchner, was Isabel Perón. And in fact, oddly enough, this was the moment in which Peronism, which was again a form of, as a good populism that it was, a classic populism, was an authoritarian form of democracy. It was almost, I mean, this was a historical moment, which is a weird moment, because that was the moment in which Peronism was very close to fascism. I mean, as you might recall, like the AAA, the Argentine neo-fascist Peronist organization, was killing people like crazy in Argentina. And this was the time, and I say this in my work, that this is the time, as far as I can tell, is the first fascist organization which is led by a woman in history. But at the same time, this is typical both fascist and populist, her presentation as a leader is a Madonna-like figure. And somehow the fact that she doesn't have kids is not related to the actual fact that most women should, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, the point is this deserves much more study, and I agree with, and in this I certainly agree with Sahar. So, I mean, now, of course I have much more to say, but I will just shut up and please go ahead. No, you can sit. I'll just set it up. Oh.
It's supposed to make it easier, but
Should come out right now.
I think I'm gonna stand if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Probably more comfortable that way. Hopefully it won't cut the text, but good evening. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm actually honored and humbled to be, among such distinguished scholars, professors, students. This is a great opportunity to talk about a subject that has been, as Federico said, widely understudied, but of great relevance, for gender studies, for the study of populism, and discourse as well. So I think it's cutting the entire thing. I don't know if there's a way of. So should I just? Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So just to give you a little bit of background, this is a chapter in, as some of you might know or not, this is a chapter in the Oxford Handbook on Populism. And I was really happy that the editors decided to include a chapter that talked about gender and populism. As we know, this has been a topic that's been widely understudied, and most studies about populism tend to focus on male leadership. Despite, as has been mentioned, that we already have populist figures that date back to the early parts of the 20th century, but somewhat these things have kind of gone under the radar. So another part of the importance of this study is that a lot of the studies of populism tend to focus on the procedural aspects of populism, which in this case include whether populist leader implements certain economic policies, certain social policies, but it kind of ignores in a bit, especially when it comes to gender, the substantive and symbolic aspect of this part of or this aspect of populism. Obviously, there has been some studies. Not to say that it has gone completely ignored. Karen Campworth has an amazing edited volume about gender and populism in Latin America, and she kind of goes over. She overlaps it with the three different periods of populism in Latin America, and there are some really interesting, conclusions which I'll actually kind of bring out as I go through the presentation. There's also the special issue of the Journal of Patterns of Prejudice. They focus a lot on Europe, and there's actually, this is probably one of the most empirically driven study, which is really interesting because we don't tend to find a lot of data when it comes to studies of populism, because especially, for instance, if you think about regimes like Venezuela, the production of data tends to be kind of subverted somewhat, so it doesn't really help us in terms of doing research. One of the things that both of these pieces of literature find, or at least the two things that they have in common, is that when it comes to gender, its approach, or the approach of populist leaders or populism towards gender, has been mostly opportunistic. So, and I'll kind of explain how, why they come to these conclusions and why I agree with them to a certain extent. So, a little bit of, how the chapter proceeds is I mainly focus on the ideational definition of populism. This is the definition I use to frame the arguments and the research in this chapter. I also look at the varieties of populism in terms of especially regionally based. Even though we tend to have left populism in Europe and we tend to have right populism in Latin America, I mainly focus on the predominant types of populism in both regions. And I can also choose to only focus on these two regions because I think they are the most important examples, and we find them the most amount of literature and data. So, making reference to these specific examples in Latin America and Europe, I go through three main categories in the chapter to kind of try to answer the question of whether there is some commonality or there are some patterns that emerge in terms of the relationship between populism and gender. The first one I focus on supporters. Obviously, they are a very important part of populist dynamics. Representation, specifically in terms of gender. And also another aspect, and this comes specifically from the definition of populism of CLACS, this aspect of the subordination of the personal identity. Because gender is one of the personal identities, so I thought it was important to explore how that works in terms of populist politics. So this is the definition that Muda uses in throughout, all of his research. So the idea is of using this this definition is that it gives us two thresholds against which to measure this relationship between populism and gender. The first is that as a thin-centered ideology, the elements that fall within the specific type of populism are context-specific. And that's something that we can't ignore, because obviously we're dealing with two different parts of the ideological spectrum. We're dealing with two different histories in terms of the treatment of gender. So I think this is a very important part of it. And the other one is the distinction between the people and the elite. Regardless of how debated and how much we still go back and forth sometimes in terms of what is the most adequate definition of populism, or how to use it most appropriately in terms of the social sciences, I think this is one aspect that always comes back and resonates with pretty much everyone that studies populism, regardless of the discipline. And it's this dichotomy between the people and the elite. So in terms of the varieties of populism, I found a couple of things that kind of are very notorious in terms of distinctions between the regions. One of them is voting rights in Latin America. This is something that during the Perón era and other countries as well, I mean, they appropriated the voting rights as a populist issue. So in that sense, it kind of, at first sight, it might seem as if populist leaders are actually working to improve gender equality or gender relations. And also, the other part of it is that in Latin America, the relationship between populism and gender is shaped by democratization processes. This is something that always comes back when we look at Latin America. In terms of European populism, they depart from a completely different place, right? We don't have the issue of voting rights for women, because populism, as we define it in Europe, comes a bit later, in the decade. So they're actually departing from a context where there is greater gender equality, and also it's shaped by the European project, right? So responses to European integration or accelerated European integration, Euroscepticism, shapes populism in Europe and its relation to gender differently. So some of the questions of interest that I tried to tackle in this chapter, I mean, the main thing I want to say is that really this chapter is not about, I don't really have my own empirical data. I'm not doing specifically my own research. It's mostly a survey of the literature that is out there. Now, considering that there is very little literature about gender and populism, I do look at certain cases specifically and try to extract some of the data that I have used to kind of build out the argument. But some of the questions is trying to understand if there is an inherent gender dimension to populism. I look at the support base for populist leaders, both in Latin America and in Europe, and try to see if there is, some pattern in terms of gendered support for populist leaders. How it has evolved over time. What are the particular features of populist representation? And the last part of it is, how it interacts with this issue of personalization of politics. So in terms of populist supporters, one of the things that I found in the literature is that, well, the main thing is we have some gender bias in terms of mainstream politics. We know, for instance, that women tend to be more supportive of left liberal politics. There is more support amongst, blue-collar males for radical right leaders in Europe. But what's interesting is that in Latin America, there isn't really a lot to say about this. There isn't evidence that there is actually a gender gap when it comes to mainstream or populist leaders. Now, I don't draw any conclusions on it because I don't know if it's just that there hasn't been any studies on it, or is it actually a lack of gender gap. So I kind of leave it right there in the chapter. I don't discuss it any further. I focus mostly on the gender gap in Europe. And basically what they find is that it's basically a more extreme version of the gender gap in terms of mainstream politics. Now, upon further review, we can see that there's great variation between the countries. So there's one thing to do the study of the gender gap entirely at the European level, and then it's a completely different thing to actually start looking at the specific countries. So some of the authors I reviewed, they find that there's a difference between 5% in some countries, like I think it's France, and then 34% in some of the Eastern European countries. So even when they control for some other factors, you have like age and religion actually increases the gap, and then you have like work, class, or education actually decreases the gap. So at the end of the day, there isn't really enough evidence to suggest that this gender gap that we're able to generalize this gender gap in terms of populist politics. The other part of it is that one of the studies found that there is a difference between the considerations that women and men attach when they decide to support populist politics. So the issues that might be relevant for men might not be necessarily relevant for women. So in terms of political representation, obviously the personalistic feature of populism is actually a subcategory of the broader idea of political representation. And for this, I use actually Pitkin's integrated model of political representation. And what I try to do is to go through each one of these, in terms of formal, descriptive, substantive, and symbolic representation, and evaluate to see how in Latin America and Europe this has evolved. These different types of political representation have evolved in terms of populist politics. So obviously the main aspect of it is that the specific form of populism and its relation to gender is shaped by the context. Again, I think this kind of comes back again and again because we can't talk about populism without talking about the specific context in which it emerges. So some of the questions that I look at is, trying to dissect whether, formal representation translates into descriptive representation, and what kind of responses that creates from supporters of populism. So when it comes to looking at whether there are inherent features of populism that increase or decrease female representation in political institutions, it's kind of mixed, right? So we have, again, things like the appropriation of the voting rights in Latin America early on. So this is a way in which formal and descriptive representation of women was increased. But then you have other things as, bringing women into the political sphere in terms of, doing more social work, more, working with the populist leaders to further their policies. So there is some, increment in terms of formal and descriptive representation, but it's not necessarily inherent in populism to do it, rather than seen as a way of using it opportunistically to further the populist cause. So the other part of it is, whether looking at if having female leaders or female populist leaders contributes to more, gender conscious public policies. And again, looking at the survey of the literature, we find the similar results. Yes, it does, create some gendered or more gender-friendly policies, but at the same time, it's done in a way that furthers the cause of the populist leaders or the populist party. So, oh, sorry, I should have skipped to this one. So one of the main differences that I find between Latin America and Europe is that there's this difference between inclusionary politics and exclusionary politics. So when it comes to policies and responses from the public to these policies, in Latin America, it creates new forms of participation. So it starts including women into politics. It creates spaces for women to be active participants in populist politics. In Europe, it's more about who should be included in these policies. So this is one of the main differences, and it's not necessarily specifically related to gender. It's more about the context in which populist politics is evolving. So one of the main patterns that I actually found, despite all these differences, is that the role of women in politics is limited to what is sanctioned as adequate for females, or for a female space in politics. This is actually very interesting because it appears again and again in the literature, but I can't really draw any conclusions on it until I think probably more studies have been done. So, but I think this is the one aspect where I find commonalities in terms of the treatment of gender by populist leaders and parties. I'm going to go quickly. So the other aspect that I look at is female populist leaders. We've actually, Federico mentioned this, is that populist leadership tends to be mainly about masculine attributes. Yet we have, quite a lot of female leadership in terms of populist politics. We have, Marine Le Pen, we have Pia, and I can't say her last name, I'm not going to even attempt it, but in Denmark. So the way, and the way I found in the literature, and at least looking at the cases, the way they reconcile this is by basically using, traditional values and public life in a way that doesn't antagonize the feminine aspect of these leaders. So in this sense, I think this goes back to the idea of femininity versus feminism. So this is something that also emerges in the literature between, that's common to Latin America and Europe. And I think it's a way of reconciling this contradiction between traditional values and public life. That, even though, so for instance, they call her Mama Pia in Denmark, and this is a way of kind of reconciling this figure of, the rigid leader with, a more softer version of, housewife or someone who's more caring. So this is one way in which, populism treats gender, and I think this is one of the few things that keeps coming up, and it's a commonality between the two. In terms of the subordination of political identity, this goes back to Laclau's definition of populism and this idea that you need an anchor. In Latin America, it's usually a leader. In Europe, it tends to be more the party. But the idea is that, and this is one of the things that makes me conclude that there's no inherently a gender dimension to populism in terms of, how it treats gender and in terms of creating policies, is that it doesn't really emanate, if this identity doesn't really emanate from the leader, then it's not really relevant to populism. And I think this goes back a little bit to what you said, Federico, is that the people don't have a voice, right? The one who speaks is the leader. But at the same time, I don't think it's a way that, it's not necessarily that the people don't have a voice, it's that their voice is merged with the voice of the leader, and they become one as the people, right? So I think in that sense, gender kind of, or the gender issues become kind of put to the side in lieu of more important personal identities that might actually be related directly to the leader. And I think this is why the reason why feminist goals are actually not seen as elitist and are not relevant in populist politics, or at least they're antagonized in populist politics. So to conclude, a few things. One is this difference between within the category of the people, and this is actually I'm really sad that Sarah is not here, because this is something that actually I wanted to kind of tie into her presentation, because looking at gender within the category of the people is kind of breaking down the people again in the same way that she's looking at it in terms of the other, breaking them down between male as as the other, and then the females within that category as the victims. So hopefully we'll have some time to talk about that. But the few things that I find is that the treatment of gender issues by populism is highly contextualized. There's no evidence really of common patterns in the treatment of gender across regions or periods. I think some of the commonalities I find are more an instance of just the treatment of gender in general, and I didn't get into this in the presentation because it's already long enough. But when you look at the history of of gender issues, the waves of feminism, some of similar patterns and issues emerge. So this makes me think that it's not necessarily the treatment of populism or populist treatment of gender, but it's just the treatment of gender overall. I think one aspect that, and I hope someone takes the lead and continues research on this, is this attachment to traditional cultural values and the feminization of the role of women in society. That is something that, as I said, continuously emerges as a constant in the relationship between populism and gender. But I don't want to draw any conclusions about it, because I don't think, at least I don't have enough evidence and research to say it. But thank you so much for having me.
Well, let me start by thanking the organizers for having me here, thanking Pamela, Amy, Michael. It's a real pleasure to be here. So let me start with some comments to Sahar's excellent chapter and presentation. You do a fantastic review of the literature, and I think that this is a crucial piece to understand how gender has been studied in relationship to populism in both Europe and Latin America. So I will make 4 very short points. I will focus on 4 points. The first issue is on the definition of populism. You talk about how populists are opportunistic. And I think that that's an inherent pattern in populism. They are opportunistic. They do not follow an ideology. I mean, Perón at some moment was following a series of policies that were based on the state intervention in the economy. When there was an economic crisis, he put people who are more, who believe in less influence of the state in charge of his economic policies. So he went from a strong nationalism to opening up the economy. Chavez never had an ideology. He was totally opportunistic. At the beginning, his project was to have a participatory democracy. And then later on, at some moment, he became a socialist, and he invented this category of socialism of the 21st century. So populists are inherently, or for the most part, they are opportunistic because they are politicians, and their aim is to get to power and to govern. Of course, there are certain elements in populism that I will not call an ideology, but it's this contraposition of the people against a series of enemies. These enemies can be the elite. In Latin America, it's the oligarchy. So this opportunism of populism and the fact that populism needs a leader. I mean, in Europe you can have small populist parties, but you always need a leader in order to have a full-blown populism. That's something that Nadia Urbinati has argued in her work. I mean, in a way you can argue that the Tea Party was a movement in search of a leader until Trump came along. And then the Tea Party, which was this collection of conservatives of different strands, right? Some more fundamentalists, others who believe who were libertarian until they found Trump. There was no movement. So I diverge a bit on the definition of populism that you use, because we have to pay more attention to the role of the leader, to the opportunistic aspects of populism. Then you point to an issue that is crucial in the comparative studies of populism, which has the variety of populism. Some populism are inclusionary, others are exclusionary. In other words, some populism aim to include the excluded, like in Latin America, right? From Perón to Chavez, they aim to include people who were politically, socioeconomically, ethnically, or culturally excluded. And they not only promise to include them, but they actually include them to a certain extent. Especially if you compare that with Europe or the United States, where populists from the beginning aim to exclude a sector of the population. In Europe is the Muslim other. In the United States is the Mexican, which means all Latinos in the United States. We're all Mexicans. I would like to tell the story about the first day of school of my kids in Kentucky. They are walking in the school and somebody says, "Hey, yo, Mexican." And my kids start to explain him that, I'm not really Mexican, I'm from Ecuador. And the response of the kids, "We don't care from what part of Mexico you are." I mean, so now I'm a Mexican in this country, so I assume that. So some forms of populism are inclusionary, others are exclusionary. And at the beginning, Mude and Rovira argue that it has to do with geographical difference, right? In Europe, they are exclusionary. In Latin America, they are inclusionary. But that didn't hold, because we have Syriza and Podemos, which are similar to Latin American populism. So then the question is, why do we have inclusionary and exclusionary populism? And Danny Filk, who's an Argentinian Israeli sociologist, said, well, perhaps the answer is colonialism, right? In places that were the metropolis, like most places in Europe, populism is exclusionary because they want to exclude the other, the other of colonial origin. And in places in which you have those that were colonized, like in Bolivia, they aim to include the excluded, because the excluded has always been raised, racialized as an inferior order. But then we have Podemos and Syriza, which do not fit in that pattern. So I don't have an answer. Just I think it's very interesting to look at these dynamics of inclusion and exclusion globally, and they do not fit into geographical patterns, or, I mean, colonialism seems to be a very good answer to that, but it's not really at the end. Then the question of femininity and feminism, I think that's a crucial point, because populism, regardless of where they are, they appeal to these notions of femininity, I guess, of the 1950s, right, of that TV series. I mean, this idea of women as mothers, of women in the proper place, as very feminine, but regarding all of these feminist issues of autonomy to a second role. And then finally, I have a question, or I do not totally agree, Sakar, with your idea that the people is not always gendered. The people in populism is always gendered. I will argue that populists have different gender projects, and these gender projects are very different. In Latin America, they aim to include women politically and socioeconomically. In other parts, they want to, I mean, the image of the people always has a gender component. So it's not that populists appeal to the people in general, but their notions of masculinity and femininity are always gendered, just to attack the elites or to paint the other as not fitting into particular gender roles. For instance, in Europe, they present the Muslim as the other who's against feminism. But the image that they have of femininity, as Sarah will tell us in a while, is based on images of colonial origin. So I think that we have to pay more attention to the way in which images of masculinity and femininity are gendered in populism. Was a brief comment.
Thank you.
So.
Yes. And, now is Carlos' presentation.
How do we go? Oh, okay. It's me again. I'm talking too much today. Well, Sahar note in her excellent chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Populism that gender continues to be a relatively unexplored topic in populist studies. And this is surprising because, as I was saying before, populist leaders, as diverse from each other as Hugo Chavez or Donald Trump, display images of hypermasculinity, first of all. Second, the notion of the people that is central to populism. If there is something that is central to populism, is the notion of the people. But the people in populism is always gendered. It's not just the people in general. The people is gendering particular notions of masculinity and femininity. And populists have significant gender projects. Trump, for example, sorry, I am on sabbatical in Ecuador, so my English is a bit rusty, more rusty than always is, but it's in general rusty, but today is even worse. Trump is at war with women's rights. Right-wing populists in Europe use gender to construct the male Muslim immigrant as a threat to the nation and to Muslim women. They want to defend not only the nation, but also Muslim women from populism. And in Latin America, populists include women's socioeconomic and political rights while rejecting feminist demands for autonomy. Scholars' silence on gender was in part due to the social scientific paradigms that they use. Gino Germani, who's the first author who systematically analyzed populism, he started to write in the 1950s, and Germani is a very interesting figure because when he was younger, he's from Italy, he was an anti-fascist activist, and he was in jail, in Mussolini's jail for a short period of time. Then his mother took him to Argentina, and in Argentina he founded the sociology department there, and it's the founding father of Argentinian sociology. And most of the Argentinian scholars who study with him, like Emilio de Ipola, Portantiero, etc., were students of Gino Germani. So he's a fundamental figure in the history of populism of Argentinian sociology, and his comparative studies of fascism and populism are key to understand what is populism. But anyways, he used modernization theory and mass society theory to try to understand what populism is. And the problem is that he argued that abrupt processes of urbanization and abrupt processes of urbanization and industrialization produces masses in a state of anomy. And these masses in a state of anomy follow a populist charlatan, a populist demagogue. So there was no space in his studies for gender. I mean, he was writing this in the 1950s, in the 60s, so we have not to be too harsh on him, but anyway, it's a blindness that comes from his theoretical approach. Then we have dependency theory, and for dependency theory, the most important thing was the relationship between core and periphery, or the class alliances behind populism, or the policies that populist leaders were producing, mostly the inclusionary policies that they have in Latin America. Of course, they were also blind to gender. And then Laclau, and this is very interesting what Sarah has to say, because in his essays on populism, Laclau, which I think is the most important and relevant contemporary theory of populism, even if we do not agree with him, we always have to go back to disagree with Laclau. He was not interested in gender, and Sarah Faris argues that it's because of his Schmittian conception of politics as a struggle between friend and enemy. And this, according to Sarah Faris, represents a strong masculine, muscular conception of politics from which women are excluded. The first study of populism and gender that I know in Latin America was by feminist historian Marisa Navarro. In her extensive work on Eva Perón, she highlighted the contradictions of populism for gender rights. Eva Perón promoted images of women as mothers and contrasted this image of mother, which is the proper image of Peronist women, to feminists. And according to Evita, and I will quote her, feminists belong to another race of humans. They are not the sort of women that the nation needs. And what are the sort of women that the Argentinian Peronist nation needed? These are women that are good mothers and good companions to their men. Of course, her attack to feminism was class-based, because feminists were of middle-class origin, and also it was politically motivated because they were part of the opposition. But despite what Eva was saying about feminists, under Peron government, women got a series of political and socioeconomic rights, such as the right to vote. The socioeconomic rights were expanded, and Eva challenged many restrictions to women's participation in the public sphere. Marisa Navarro wrote, and let me quote her, Eva was the founder and the president of a political party, the women's branch of the Peronist Party. She was acclaimed as the charismatic standard bearer of the shirtless, the abanderada de los descamisados. She became Perón's liaison with the General Confederation of Workers. She was the only woman sitting in the Superior Council of the Peronist Party, and she was involved in politics on a daily basis from 1946 until she died. Different from the past, as Zahar was saying, there are more books and journal articles on gender and populism. Karen Kampwirth, sorry, I'm killing her last name, in her excellent edited volume, uses theories of populism as a style and a strategy to analyze the distinct waves of populism in Latin America, how populist leaderships construct images of masculinity and femininity, on gender, populism, and democracy, and populism and feminism. Cas Mude and Cristobal that you were quoting, they understand populism as a series of ideas on politics, and they have also written a lot, they have written, not a lot, but a few articles comparing South America and Northern Europe. They wrongly assert that gender is irrelevant in the populist construction of the people, and they mistake stereotypes for gender scholarship. For instance, in an excellent volume entitled Populism, a Short Introduction, they argue that the populist strongman is more likely to be attractive to people in societies with a more traditional machismo culture like Latin America. And unless Donald Trump and his supporters are considered to be Mexicans, this image based on the old notion of the Latin American primitive and macho order is inaccurate. How to account for the fact that Trump emerged in the US that, according to these authors, is a more capitalistic and materialistic culture. Macho populist leaders have appeared in the North with Trump or Silvio Berlusconi, or in the global South with Evo Morales or Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. Contrary to these binary oppositions of colonial origins of a civilized North versus a primitive South, Federico Finchestein, in the book that he brought here, show the similarities in the construction of hypermasculinity of Berlusconi, Trump, Duterte, or Abdallah Bucaran. These politicians brag about their ability to grab any women they choose, of their hypervirility as manifested by the size of the genitals, in their sexual powers. Federico also shows the links between images of hypermasculinity, populist autocratic politics, and early fascist experiences. Like the fascists, Trump politicized racism and hypermasculinity, but different from fascists, at least until now, he has not physically aimed to eliminate his enemies, such as the Mexican order, the Muslim order, or the militant African American order. I first wrote about gender and populism when studying Abdallah Bucaran. He was briefly president of Ecuador for 6 months in the mid-90s. Abdallah contrasted what he labeled as the effeminate men of the elite, of the oligarchy, to the peoples and to his own virility and masculinity. He also portrayed working class women as the standard bearers of proper femininity, and women of the elite were considered to be lazy women who never cook, who never take care of their kids. And what is interesting about Bucaran is that at the same time that he was challenging the cultural power of men and women of the elite, he was reinforcing women's subordination as mothers and sexual objects. While he questioned how women of the elite sexually harassed poor women and the emasculation of working class men that could not protect and defend their own women, he also reproduced crude notions of masculinity centered on the control of women's body. I agree with the organizers on the importance of looking at Latin America to understand gender and populism in any part of the world. First of all, Latin America gave birth to modern populism, as Federico argued in one of his previous works, and it also generated the most paradigmatic expressions of populism, Peronism and Chavismo. Second, in this continent, we have, in Latin America, we have a long experience with populist challenging power, but also with populist regimes. I mean, what to some people appear as a novelty, which is populist in power, for us has been a constant since the 1940s. Third, because the most sophisticated debates on populism originated in Latin America. Fourth, because Latin American populism is the place where inclusionary forms of populism took place, whereas in Europe and the United States, the more ugly face of populism manifests itself. Fifth, because Latin American populism has ambiguity for gender rights. It recognizes women's political and socioeconomic rights while promoting traditional notions of masculinity and femininity. So that's why we have to look at Latin America to try to put in comparative perspective what is happening to gender and populism worldwide. From Perón to Chavez, these leaders promoted the socioeconomic incorporation of women as mothers whose duty was to educate national populist citizens. The privileged image of Perón's femininity was motherhood. In an article published in his party magazine, Perón explained, "I have faith in women because I have faith in mothers." But Perón gave women the right to vote in 51. 7 women became senators at that time. 24 women became elected to Congress. And Delia Parodi was the vice president of the Chamber of Deputies. So the incorporation of women under Perón, and regardless of the rhetoric against feminism, was quite visible, quite important. Voter turnout under Peronism surged from 18% of the population in 1946 to 50% in 55. His government redistributed wealth and increased the share of wages in the national product. Female and male workers received other material benefits, such as social and medical services, paid vacations. It expanded consumption, especially food consumption, to the poor, and used the educational system to create Peronist citizens. Women's illiteracy was reduced from 15% in 47 to 9% in 58, while the proportion of women attending college increased from 15% in 46 to 44% in 1955. The dominant view of populists of the 21st century, like Chavez, Morales, and Correa, was also to be caretakers. Chavez, for instance, says in Women's Day, Venezuelan women are the soul and the essence of the revolutionary process. They are giving birth to a new country. Being a housewife is dignified work. Now, it's very interesting what happened in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, because they use, one of the innovations of populism of the 21st century was to use participatory mechanisms to create new constitutions. And participation in these constitution-making processes gave opportunity to activists to promote gender and, to a lesser extent, LGBTQ rights. In Venezuela, for instance, the 1999 constitution banned discrimination and domestic violence, gave pensions to housewives, and gave breastfeeding protection. In Bolivia, the constitution banned discrimination based on sex, gender, and sexual orientation, color, and pregnancy, and recognized sexual and reproductive rights. The Ecuadorian constitution included an anti-discrimination clause and on the basis of gender identity as well as gender orientation. So participation in these constitution-making mechanisms in the Bolivarian nations allowed women to put gender and, to a lesser extent, LGBTQ rights in the agenda. Now, despite fulfilling some of these rights, there were many contradictions. In Venezuela, under Chavez or Maduro, or with Morales, according to Javier Corrales, they did not include any rights for lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transsexuals, and queers. In Ecuador under Correa, there were more ambiguity. The Ecuadorian constitution, for instance, changed the traditional view of the family and recognized non-kinship-based households, but stipulated that the only marriage that can take place is between a man and a woman. And President Correa, who's a Catholic, voiced his opposition to same-sex marriage, to abortion that continues to be illegal, and attacked gender studies. He He has a PhD, he's an economist. He says that the gender ideology fails under any academic analysis. The image of most populist leaders has been to be the fathers of their nation. And in general, in Latin America, populists promoted the inclusion of the poor and of women while reinforcing traditional notions of the family and of women as caretakers. While they sometimes fulfilled feminist demands, they were anti-feminist and used images of hyper-masculinity of the patriarchal leader. But different from Latin America, that were autocratic yet inclusionary forms of populism, Trump in the United States is aiming to reverse the conquest of feminist and anti-racist movements since the 1960s. He has already transformed the inclusionary public sphere. Nowadays, it's normal to use hate speech, sexism, racism, and xenophobia. And Sarah Faris shows how the image of the Muslim men is used by right-wing populists to both present Muslim men as a threat to the nation and to aim to protect women. Not all populists are the same. Not all of them have the same gender projects. At the same time that populists in Latin America included politically, socioeconomically, and culturally, they assumed that they were the embodiment of the people and imposed their views of gender authenticity. Those who challenged their view on politics and gender and sexuality were constructed as enemies of the people, the leader, and the nation. Differently from inclusionary forms of populism that at least promise a better democracy and are forward-looking and partially included women's political and socioeconomic rights, exclusionary right-wing populism in the United States and in Europe is the biggest threat to democracy, gender equality, and even to the entire project of the Enlightenment. Thank you, and I pass my time.
So now, Saja comienza con Carlos, ¿no?
So one of the things that I wanted to kind of, I think this ties into some of the things that I talked about and some of the things that Federica talked about, is the idea of the definition of the people, right? And I think this is where sometimes studies of populism kind of, I don't want to say hit a wall, but sometimes it kind of becomes difficult to marry the empirics with the normative aspect of the definition, right? So one of the things that I use in some of the, the studies of populism, that when I look at it, is that the definition of the people comes from a normative standpoint, right? It's, if it embodies the leader and if it is about creating two camps that oppose each other, then we're talking about homogenization, right? The people, there's no room for specific identities, there's no room for specificities, right? And in that, I think that's where gender also as a personal identity falls. So I think in that sense, from a normative perspective, you would say that gender as a personal identity gets subverted. But then, like you say, Carlos, it's not necessarily the case, because we do have and we do see a gender dimension to populism, especially in its different varieties when it comes up in Europe and in Latin America. So I think one of and this is more of a comment question, because I think I want us to have a conversation about this, is that, how do we reconcile that, right? How do we reconcile the empirics with the normative aspect of the definition in terms of, populism studies, and specifically in terms of its relationship to gender? I don't know if you wanna, should I keep going?
So we can open as a conversation, no? Or what? Oh, the reading, of course. Yeah, sure. Oh. Yeah, okay. yes. Sarah couldn't be here today, so we will read her presentation. Oh, we have a video. Oh, great. Even better. That's even better.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Michael and Pamela for inviting me to this conference. And I am very sorry that I am unable to be there today. Probably you already were informed about this. But in any case, I am glad that I am able to record the talk that I was going to give. So the paper I am presenting, I should say I am recording today, draws on my recent book, In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Femo-Nationalism, which is the book in which I analyze the mobilization of gender equality issues by nationalist parties in anti-immigration and Islamophobic campaigns. I call this phenomenon Femo-Nationalism. Now, this paper in particular tries to explain why the category of populism is not very useful when you try to understand this Femo-Nationalist phenomenon, and in particular when we try to understand the double standard that is applied to Muslim males and females, a double standard according to which Muslim men are the oppressors of women, the misogynist others, and the women are usually the victims to be rescued. So in the second half of the 2000s, sociologists and political scientists seeking to understand why some right-wing parties began to mobilize issues of women's rights in anti-Islam and anti-immigration campaigns resorted to theories of populism. Scholars indeed believe that traditional political categories associated to the far right or fascism could not entirely justify or could not entirely make justice of these parties' new tactics. So, for instance, the adoption of themes such as gay and women's rights, the emphasis upon not only the Christian but also the Jewish roots of Europe, their growing capacity to attract voters who do not position themselves on the right or who were not a traditional constituency for these parties, particularly women, the appeal to the people as the only legitimate sovereign, and an emphasis upon the community rather than the state, they have all been considered as novelties that somehow cannot be explained simply by calling these parties fascist or far-right parties. So these scholars thought that a turn to the conceptual apparatus of populism was somehow necessary for a clearer understanding of these parties' seemingly phylogynist agendas. Now, whether comprehended as the primacy of the charismatic leader over the political program or the abandonment of classical and outdated ideologies of 20th centuries, most theories of populism have agreed on a characterization of the populist party as one that attempts to foment the people against a challenger to their interests, the state, the political elite, the immigrant, and so forth. In other words, although the term populism has been conceptualized in a variety of ways, all definitions concur in what I would call a formalistic understanding of populism. According to this perspective, populism ultimately is the politics of dichotomizing the political space into an us, the pure people, versus them, the corrupt elite or the foreigner. Populist politics, that is not defined by its content, but by its form. The instrumental mobilization of women's rights in anti-Islam and anti-immigration campaigns by several European right-wing parties could thus be understood in terms of these parties' identification of a clear enemy, the male Muslim and the immigrant in this case. So the identification of a clear enemy against whom the people can articulate their anger and demands. Now, one should notice that it is precisely the formalism of the predominant definition of populism that enables both left-wing and right-wing parties and movements to be labeled as populist. Ernesto Laclau, particularly in his book On the Populist Reason, has played a central role in establishing and deepening this formalistic approach to the study of populism. So in this paper, I aim to demonstrate that the concept of populism is unable to help us to analyze the reasons why right-wing parties resort to women's rights. In order to lay out my argument, I will first reconstruct some of the most influential interpretations of right-wing populism, and particularly, as you will see, I will focus to Ernesto Laclau' influential contribution. And I will argue that its limitations become apparent when we consider right-wing parties' sudden embrace of feminist-friendly themes. On this basis, I show that theories of nationalism, and particularly the ones developed by post-colonial feminists and within critical race theories, are better suited to decipher both the novelty of the way in which Muslim and non-Western migrant women are represented as victims to be rescued, as well as the historical regularities upon which such representations draw. So let me begin with Laclau's influential definition of populism. In his 2005 book on populist reason, Laclau develops a sophisticated theory of populism as a specific logic of the political, reacting against the criticisms leveled against populism as the irrationality of the masses or limbo of political indeterminacy. Laclau attempts to demonstrate that populism possesses its own reason. Laclau ultimately equates populism and politics, but what's interesting here is that for him, and I'm quoting, "We only have populism if there is a series of political discursive practices constructing a popular subject, and the precondition of the emergence of such a subject is the building up of an internal frontier dividing the social space into two camps." End of the quote. So the dichotomization of the social space takes the form of an us counterposed to a them, in which the us is homogenized and its internal differences are neutralized, at least temporarily, because a logic of equivalence prevails over a logic of difference. The dichotomization of the social space into two camps is crucial, for frontiers are the sine qua non of the emergence of the people, which is another quote from Laclau. Now, my question is, can this characterization of populism as this dichotomous space, us versus them, help us to understand the mobilization of feminist ideas by contemporary populist parties? So, while the identification of an enemy against which the populist subject converges might seem to be able to describe accurately the contemporary anti-Islam and anti-immigrants campaigns that so strongly mark populist propaganda, how do we then explain how Muslim women and non-Western migrant women more generally have come to constitute an exception? So in other words, on what basis are they seemingly subtracted from the enemy camp? If the identity of the people, which is forged on the construction of the populist moment, requires the identification of the other as the enemy, then under what conditions can this enemy be split into two different camps, that is, the camp of the male enemy and the camp of the Muslim migrant female victim? So in opposition to this formalism, I argue that it is only by analyzing the concrete slogans and the policies deployed by these right-wing parties, that is, by analyzing their content and not simply their form, that we can begin to comprehend the above reasons, that we can, in other words, begin to comprehend why these parties seem to, again, to divide this enemy into the enemy which is made of the women as the victims and the males of the oppressors. So first of all, we should acknowledge that the people that is called upon to act against the other is not a shapeless demos, but a specific ethnos or natio. Accordingly, the enemy against which populists call on the people to forge their identity is not an empty signifier that could be filled by any collectivity or group, but in the contemporary context, it is a determinate political, national, and economic signifier, namely the non-Western migrant and especially the Muslim. They are outsiders, first and foremost, because they are non-nationals and bearers of differences, cultural, religious, historical, economic, and so forth, that interfere in the chain of equivalences that constructs the people as one political national subject. In order to make use of the concept of populism in any meaningful way, to describe some of the harshest European right-wing parties, therefore, it must be embedded, the concept of populism must be embedded within the conceptual apparatus of nationalism. So let me give you some very brief examples. European right-wing parties that have been called the populists, such as the PVV in the Netherlands, National Front, or Matteo Salvini Northern League in Italy, all of them have paid increasing attention to women's issues in the last decade, while simultaneously embarking upon denunciation of Muslim and immigrant males as sexual threats. When we look at the attention they actually paid on women, we can see that some of the policies they proposed concerning gender, particularly in the case of the National Front in France and the Northern League in Italy, they related to classical right-wing nationalist concerns for women's fertility rates. In other words, these parties expressed alarm over the fall in Western European women's fertility. Such alarm is strictly related to the privileging of national ethnic criteria of inclusiveness, as well as to their call for national women to reproduce the nation in a literal sense. The PVV, the Front National, and the Northern League are all strong advocates of a type of nationalism based on folk and Kultur, which is ethnicity and culture, which promotes an idea of the nation as an organic whole, supposedly homogeneous in religious, cultural, and racial or ethnic dimensions. These parties articulate a political program that privileges national or regional economic interests versus European or international interests. Furthermore, they fabricate references to common origins, ethnos, and culture in order to instantiate the bonds of mythical lost communities, thereby excluding immigrants from this space. Now, recognizing that notions such as the Volksnation and Kulturnation constitute the fundamental political substrate of these policies of these parties enables us to address the gender dimensions of nationalism. Women have always been central to nationalist projects, already at the iconographic level. Just think of how many nations are portrayed as women. Think of France, think of Italy. We have really many examples across the world in which we see that the nation is represented as a woman. So the iconographic and symbolic centrality of women to the nation, which is very common, as I said, across the world, however, is deceiving. For while it has constantly been affirmed, women were at the same time relegated to the margins of the polity. This is the paradox lying at the heart of most national narratives, as Anne McClintock puts it, for the role of women within nationalist political projects has historically been a metaphoric one, unlike the metonymic role accorded to men. The symbolic importance attributed to women by nationalist discourses does not in fact refer to women as singularity, but rather as part of an organic whole whose subjectivity and social role is established on the basis of the functions of the female body. For nationalist ideology and its categorizing customs, women were homogenized, considered not as individuals but as types. The ideal type of femininity, as an aestheticized and social construction, whose chief function lies in reproduction, became a powerful normative stereotype from the 18th century onwards. It coincided with the rise of the nation-state and the development of nationalist rhetoric, alongside the institution of the family as the center of the national community and of the household as the allegory of the private sphere, where women allegedly find their appropriate role. The rise of modern nations and nationalisms in the 18th century went together with the development of what Foucault called the political economy of the population. The nation, its future, and its fortune were strictly linked to the number and the uprightness of its citizens, to their marriage roles and family organization, as well as to their sexual practice. Preoccupation with population control was the result of the construction of nation states as sovereign entities whose wealth and power strictly depended upon the number and compliance of their citizens. In this context, women have been linked to the nation in a twofold manner: qua members of the collectivity, and therefore subjected to the duty of loyalty required from all members, and qua women, thus bearers of ascribed roles and distinct tasks, above all that of reproducing the nation. Likewise, there are abundant 20th century examples of birth rate policies figuring among the chief concerns of nationalist movements. The identification of women not as individuals but rather as bearers of the collective or biological reproducers of the nation lies at the very heart of nationalist projects, and it is precisely in this capacity that the aforementioned contemporary right-wing parties and their alarm over European women low fertility rates should be understood. They are designed to encourage national women to be mothers for the nation's future generations, and thus to ensure the nation's ethnic homogeneity. But the question now is, we can understand, using the tools provided by theories of nationalists, particularly in the ways they've been developed within post-colonial feminism, we can understand why nationalists are so concerned with women. But why have these nationalist right-wing parties, while clearly aiming to keep foreign males apart from national women, to encourage the latter to reproduce the nation, why they have simultaneously endorsed arguments presenting Muslim and non-Western women as victims to be saved? In other words, how can the femo-nationalist rhetoric of rescuing Muslim and other non-Western women possibly combine with an emphasis upon defending national women? So if nationalist right-wing parties aim to preserve the purity of the nation along racial lines, why would they want to save non-national women from non-national men? Do they limit themselves to evoking rescuing narratives, or do they propose concrete rescuing policies as well? And ultimately, to what do these rescuing discourses and policies amount? Now, to make sense of the reasons why right-wing nationalist parties conceive of Muslim and non-Western migrant men as oppressors and of women as victims to be rescued, I argue that we need to foreground how racism is squarely involved in this dichotomizing process. So my claim here is that racism, as both the process of categorization of certain groups of people as inferior according to phenotypical or cultural markers, and as the practice of their exclusion, is the necessary corollary of the type of folk and Kulturnation nationalism that characterizes these right-wing nationalist parties. However, the type of racism these parties exhibit operates simultaneously and paradoxically through the exclusion of the male and the conditional inclusion of the female other. In other words, in order to decode this type of racist double standard that nationalist right-wing parties apply to non-Western migrant men and women, we can now turn to two intertwined conceptual tools developed by critical race scholars, and I'm referring to the concept of sexualization of racism and the racialization of sexism. On the one hand, the notion of sexualization of racism emphasizes that racism is sexed because it relies upon different stereotypes of othered men and women as oppressors and sexual threats, and as victims and sexual objects of property, respectively. But it is also sexualized insofar as the racist imagery operates through powerful sexual metaphors and desires. That is, racist ideologies express the desire to dominate the other through the fantasy of possessing the body of the racialized woman and of sexually humiliating the racialized man. On the other hand, the notion of racialization of sexism foregrounds the ways in which racism operates through the portrayal of sexism and patriarchy as the exclusive domains of the non-Western and Muslim other. The racist stigmatization of the other depends thus on the description of the other's culture as a sexist hell for women, thereby implying the danger of importing such nefarious sexist practices and relations into the West if foreign men are allowed to enter its borders. Referring to the racist underpinning of the European right-wing parties that have been referring to today, as well as the sexual fantasies behind their nationalist, xenophobic repertoire, is thus key to understanding the foregrounding of Muslim and non-Western migrant women as victims to be rescued. Above all, it enables us to see how the legacy of those fantasies in the context of the metropoles reenacts the unresolved conflict between ex-colonial subjects and Western European nationalisms. Certainly, I want to emphasize that this is only one part and one important side of the interpretation. We need to look also at other aspects in order to understand why these right-wing parties are increasingly portraying Muslim and non-Western migrant women as victims who can be the redeemable subjects as opposed to the non-redeemable subjects who usually are the Muslim and non-Western migrant men. So in this paper I'm just giving one side, for obvious reasons of time, one side of the story, but in my book I explore also the important economic aspects of these femo-nationalist phenomenon. But just to conclude, I would say that ultimately, if we want to grasp the reasons for the sudden and instrumental mobilization of gender issues by these right-wing parties, that is one fundamental dimension of what I call femo-nationalism, we need to understand populism not as the master signifier of contemporary right-wing politics vis-à-vis women and non-Western migrants, but rather we can say populism is probably a political style or a rhetorical device, if you like, whose conceptual signifier, however, lies in nationalism and its historical racist institutions. So nationalism and racist nationalism is really the key rather than populism to understand why these right-wing parties all across Europe are increasingly mobilizing gender equality against migrants and Muslims. Thank you.
Carlos will comment on Sarah Farley's paper.
Too bad Sarah is not here. Anyways, I think that her presentation and the chapter of her book that it's based on, from where she draws her presentation, gives a fantastic analysis of Laclau's theory of populism. It's a very sophisticated critique of Laclau from a perspective that I'd never read before, which is a feminist perspective, a feminist critique to Laclau. So that's something that is very interesting because most of the other critiques to Laclau, I'm thinking about Andrew Arato's critique of Laclau. Arato focuses more on the authoritarian aspects of Laclau theory, but without looking at gender. But she does a fantastic job looking at Laclau's silence on gender. And she shows that in order to understand populism, you can not only understand populism as a particular form, but you also have to look at the content. I think that what is also interesting about this presentation is the emphasis on the links between nationalism and populism. And I think that's something that we always have to pay attention to. And of course, in Europe, the links between nationalism and populism are of an exclusionary notion, are these notions of an imperialistic nostalgia, perhaps very similar to the United States in that sense. And here, nationalism shows its more ugly face. It's ugly face in excluding particular populations because they are considered to be the other, and these images of the other always come from colonial times, right? The image of the predatory men, of the dangerous men, and of the women who are available behind their veils, or all of these fantasies of white colonial men about colonized subjects. But my problems with the paper, and that's why I wish she will be here, is because first of all, she's looking at all of these issues only from the north, right? So there are other articulations of nationalism and populism. Perhaps you can argue that theoretically the articulations of nationalism and populism, which be much more inclusionary and perhaps even liberatory if you look at it from the south, from Latin America, because these are colonized places in which the other is the other who has been colonized, right? The indigenous in Bolivia, for instance. And you could imagine that at least theoretically the links between nationalism and populism could be much more liberatory. However, the experience of nationalism and populism in Latin America have been much more complicated. To use the two most paradigmatic cases, which are Peronism and Chavismo, because in both cases you have a military man, and of course the military always claim to talk on behalf of the nation. You have these military men claiming to be the embodiment of the nation, imposing particular notions of femininity and masculinity. So even if you look at the best cases articulations between nationalism and populism, they tend to be exclusionary. But of course, it's not necessarily based on these exclusions, based on the sexualizations of racism. Of course, some of that is also present. There is a very interesting chapter in Nancy Postero's recent book on Evo Morales, but that's one of the things that I wanted to say. Another thing that I want to say is that Sarah only looks at one particular theory of populism, Laclau's theory of populism, as it will be the only approach that it's out there to analyze populism. And in a contradictory way, because towards the end of her talk and of her paper, she says that it's much better to understand populism as a particular political style. If you are going to understand populism as a political style, you will look at the performance and the discourses of populism, the content and the form, but also at the strategies. And I think that the strategies are very important, or as important as the performances.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And then I will just like to say a couple of things, and then we can open the floor for the Q&A and a further, a larger dialogue. When I was listening to all of you, I was thinking, I was thinking of going Bourdieu in a certain sense. That whether we are talking about symbolic violence, and even when it is inclusive. There is always a sense that there is a secondary role for women in society. This is not exactly as equal, and I think here Sahar's, the contrast that you establish between femininity and feminism is very important here. I was thinking about this famous quote from Eva Perón, who said, at one point she said, that Perón was like a father to her. We are talking about her husband. And she said that Perón is my sun, Perón is the sky, and so on and so forth. And how equal this model can be. And this is exactly at the point in which, as Carlos reminded us, she was writing against feminism. So not only there is not an equal place here, but actually, starting with the 1940s, they rejected theories that argued for an equal place. So this is interesting as well. When you look about, even in the cases, in the European cases that Sarah was referring to, I think there is the same logic. These are men that are defending, these Muslim women. It's always men that are there to have a kind of a fatherly role. I'm not sure Mike Pence is a populist, but he refers to his own wife as mother. So this mother-father kind of situation is not really an equal situation. And this is not, this is not a small thing. I remember when Nestor Kirchner died, Christina Kirchner, who, their plan was that first he was going to be the president, then she was going to be the president, then he was going to be the president, but he died. And in a weird thing, this was very strange for Argentina, which is a country that I know very well, and she's the only person in Argentina that I know of that she wore like a black dress for at least a year, because her husband has died. So she was playing, not the figure only of the leader, but of the widow. And all this, this might sound Mediterranean to you, but it sounds strange to Argentine. I mean, this is not like this was not. I mean, this was a particular performance, which she was feeling with a particular content, which is that of the woman as the wife, which in practice is the leader, by the way. But it's always. But I think this issue of performance and language is central, because this is not really a matter only of style, but rather what you. I mean, how you want to represent yourself and how you want to represent the world, and eventually that is a representation of the people. At the same time that we have in other lists, and we, this distinction between Latin America as inclusion and Europe as exclusion, I think is very problematic. I mean, for those of us that live in Latin America in the 1990s, you might recall that all the populists in the 1990s, or the majority of them in Latin America, were neoliberals. And these are the people actually, which is surprising. And again, we need more studies on this. We had, like Trump, a kind of phallic obsession to represent the people. I mean, and this is exactly like this. I mean, this is the way in which they were talking. And then this idea of castration. I mean, it was, as Carlos reminded us in his work, it was Bucaram that received Lorena Bobbitt in his palace, in the government palace, in order to show somehow that this was a message to, I guess, the wrong type of men, perhaps imperialists or people that are not the right way in which, let's say, the normative way in which masculinity should work or should perform. At the same time, like we have people like Berlusconi, who even in the last election, I was listening to a kind of press conference, and at one point Berlusconi will say, this was like 3 or 4 weeks ago, Berlusconi will say, well, I am the candidate. He was insisting that people should vote for him, and he said, you should vote for me, tell your daughter, tell your wife, and then the joke, tell your lover. But always talking to a man. And the idea here, and I think we should really pay attention to this sort of populist humor, which is supposedly how men speak in locker rooms and so on, because these are particular, and there is a lot of ideas that populism is not ideological. Well, this is quite ideological, and here a feminist perspective will help you understand this. Because, this is extremely ideological. The idea that, that somehow this is, this is what men, or how men are, or how men want to talk, but they cannot, again, and here the leader, again, speaks for the voiceless. Right? Because this is how all men talk, Trump says, or this is what Berlusconi will tell you, in many ways. And Berlusconi, but again, I try a little bit to do this in my book, but just a little bit. And I think we should take this very weird kind of humor very seriously, because it's all the time a way to refer to how the world should function. And I would like to finish with a nice quotation from a populist intellectual and current theorist, which is Steve Bannon. And this is a recent interview 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you might have seen this, but I would like to read from this as a kind of food for thought. We should reflect on this. Bannon said, Bannon expressed his deep admiration for Mussolini. And this is what he said. He was clearly loved by women. He was a guy's guy. He has all that virility. He also had an amazing fashion sense. That whole thing with uniforms. I'm fascinated by Mussolini. So I perhaps can, now we can open the floor for on that note. So I can be the moderator taking the. Should we collect or should we? What do you suggest? Okay, so we will collect 3 questions, and please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. Yeah, thank you. Well, I actually a question to Carlos, but I'll start with a short reflection on Sarah Ferry's presentation. I like the argument. The only problem that I have with it is that probably Laclau wouldn't call the politicians and the movements that she analyzes in her talk populist. Well, I'm not sure about that. Again, that's a problem of confusing classic nationalism and ethnocentrism with populism. Not all kind of nationalism necessarily populism. Well, my guess would be that from Laclau's perspective, the problem with this kind of protection for Muslim women does nothing to enfranchise them, to empower them, or to create a political alliance with them, which is why this kind of rhetoric is probably not populist at all. So my question to you would, given your reflection on this ambivalence of relationship between populism and gender in Latin American experience, is well, how would you actually theorize that? I mean, is there something inherent to populism, or at least Latin American populism, which makes it prone to this kind of ambiguous attitude with women, enfranchising them at once, and ideologically subordinating them? Or is it just a contingent on some external factors? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, so this question is also for Carlos de la Torre. I was just really curious and intrigued about the statement specifically talking about how populism in Latin America, looking from the South, that it has been more inclusionary. And my question was, I'm curious what you mean by that, because for me at least, I feel like populism in Latin America has in many ways been exclusionary, and really, I was really fascinated by Sarah's presentation talking about the racist nationalism. And so I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, because I feel that a lot of the appeals to the masses, particularly looking at Ecuador, the discourse has been embedded in this exclusionary politics against indigenous peoples, against afrodescendientes in Ecuador, not just in discourse, but even in Correa's tangible strategies and policies that are impacting these communities. So I'm just kind of curious about that, and the relationship between, populism, the populist project, and how that's interwoven with this larger nationalist agenda, because I know Correa also refers back to Eloy Alfaro, right? And also thinking back to Eloy Alfaro, which also, I don't know if you would consider him a populist, but also had this like liberal nationalist agenda, and that used this appeal to indigenous peoples and then kind of burnt them, right? And like didn't really address their demands during the liberal revolution earlier in Ecuador's history, right? So like to what extent is there this pattern of exclusionary politics? So I was just kind of curious what you meant by that it's inclusionary, when I guess I feel like it's been more exclusionary. But
yes, you have a question, right? Yeah.
Hi. I've been working in Venezuela with grassroots movement, and I don't particularly work with populism, like as a concept. I don't theorize it. But it's interesting. Well, this conversation is interesting to think about certain things. So one of the things is that, so populism helps us look at I feel like a certain aspect of politics, right? Maybe the performative, discursive, certain aspects of representation, but then I don't know how much it helps to look at what actually happens on the ground, maybe, right? Like what happens with these discourses and these women who actually feel like this political discourse is including them, right? So what kinds of effects can that have? Then my other common question is about feminism per se in Latin America, right? So for me, one of the questions has been to see that there isn't a feminist discourse, for example, in Chavismo, but there are feminist practices at a certain level, right? With specific, I worked with a very small group of activists who took their practice very seriously. So I'm not talking about Venezuelan society in general, um, but it seems to me that also something that we should look at is the specific history of popular feminism in Latin America, and the tensions between, more liberal academic feminism and the kinds of feminist practices that women have, even if it's only as mothers, on the ground. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I just would like to mention one little anecdote, but and then I will I mean that's what all I want to say. That is that this is something that I got from my book. In 2000, Chavez was talking in his TV show, and he addressed his wife at the time in this TV show. He faced the camera and he said, "Marisabel, be ready tonight. I will give to you what is yours." Now, the question is like, I want to take this seriously in terms of what, the question is what is being addressed, what is the role of women in this statement, and what is the leader here displaying on TV. So my point is that is, I think you make an important point, which is that we should not only focus on the leaders, and we should see how this is received. Again, right, exactly. And again, what is the meaning making that is going on with this? Taking this as a face value to me, let's say analyzing the particular ideology displayed here, and I don't think this is a style. This is not a matter of style. This is what he wants to say to his wives. And what and this is the message that he conveys about what kind of husband he is on TV. Basically, it's a show of how how his this kind of hyper masculinity will be displayed at night. And it is a political event, but it's a very dubious one in terms of democratic openings, according to me. But anyway, so that's all I wanted to mention. So, you guys.
Well, let me start with your comment about. I agree with Federico. Most of the literature on populism has focused on the words of the leader, the performances of the leader, or the ideologies of political parties, and not so much on how that is received, reinterpreted, and addressed by the followers. And of course, but it's, it depends on who you are reading and what are you looking at in populism, but it's very important also to look at the reception and how people at the grassroots use the openings of the political system of populism to present their own demands. So if you look at the different, let's focus on the last wave of populism in Latin America, in which you have a top-down populism of a technocratic origin with Correa, and the openings there for popular organizations were not that great. With Chavismo, much more, because he created from the top down a series of participatory institutions that the people appropriated. And in the name of Chavez and using his words, they tried to present their own agendas. And in the case of Morales, a much more bottom-up type of populism. So I think that we have to differentiate these different experiences. What is the role and how much can people from the bottom try to push in terms of their demands? And of course, you can argue that there is an element of popular feminism, right? In the sense that women use the traditional image of women to look for the betterment of their communities. But these forms of popular feminism are based on particular constructions of femininity that are problematic and non-liberatory because it's based on patriarchal notions, heteronormativity, etc., which it's blind to the reality of other women and other families that you have in Latin America. Then this issue of inclusion and exclusion. When Casmude and Rovira started to compare Latin America and Europe, they came with this difference between inclusionary forms of populism that come from Latin America, where politically, socioeconomically, culturally, people who are excluded are included versus exclusionary forms of populism. But you're totally right. populism is inclusionary and exclusionary. It includes some and excludes others. And in the case of Correa, you are totally right. I mean, Correa used the language of the people to create a mestizo version of who the real people are. And that was very important because in the context of Ecuador, his idea was that there were indigenous mobilizations that toppled three governments before he got to power. So part of his strategy, and we're talking about the leftists with a PhD, was to create a form of, was to diminish the power of the indigenous movement. And what is very interesting is that he came again with a project of mestizaje to silence indigenous voices, which shows that Latin American populism has always been not only gendered, but also racialized. I mean, the project of populism of the for instance, of the Bolivian revolution of the 1950s was to create a mestizo nation. Velasco Ibarra in Ecuador and other populists of that time talk about a mestizo nation that silenced indigenous voices and that silenced Afro-descendant voices. And I mean, that will vary in different populism. I mean, at least Raúl Madrid argues that in Bolivia you have certain forms of ethnopopulism that constructs the category of the people as predominantly indigenous, but there's also a room for mestizos there. So I think that we have to do more research on that, but populism is always not only gender, but also racialized. And then populism is ambiguous to everything. I mean, in Latin America, populism has been ambiguous to democracy. Inclusionary, I mean, women, for instance, they expanded the franchise. The first wave of populism included people who could not vote. It was the first wave of political incorporation of people. So you can, and their socioeconomic policies were inclusionary to a big extent. But at the same time, it was profoundly exclusionary because if you were not part of the people, you were an enemy of the people, the leader and the nation. The same ambiguities you can see in terms of their gender policies. I mean, certain forms of femininity and masculinity were valued or were used by the leader to attack men and women of the elite. So populism it's a bundle of ambiguities. And that's what makes many people very uncomfortable with the concept, because you cannot really use it very well for empirical analysis, I mean, in the positivist tradition. But if you look at the complexities of populism historically, or ethnographically, you can point out much better that these ambiguities that are inherent to the way in which they imagine, they conceptualize politics, they live politics, it's there. I mean, it's not there. I mean, but it's how they perform, how they act, how they talk.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things. So in terms of the idea of exclusion versus inclusionary politics or populism, I totally agree. Like once you establish exclusion, you have inclusion, right? There's, once you create the limits, some people are outside and some people are inside. But I think maybe, resolving this contradiction, this is where the role of discourse or language, I guess, comes into play, because it's not only about the performance or what kind of policies they're implementing, but it's also about what are they prioritizing in their discourse. And I think probably, or maybe this is where the idea of inclusionary populism in Latin America comes from, and the exclusionary part in Europe. Because in Latin America, it's, populism has been about, bringing people out of the shadow, creating more social policies, changing, certain dynamics that have led to massive poverty. I mean, in Venezuela before Chavez, and one of the elements that Chavez used in his election is that, the country had over the, more than the majority of the population was living in some form of poverty. So in that way, I think maybe it's highlighting this discourse of inclusion, rather than in Europe, you have this kind of xenophobic appeal, right? We don't want to include these people into our society. So I don't know, I mean, obviously,
But then I would like to add, I mean, in Latin America, again, I mean, sometimes, I mean, I'm saying this obviously because I'm an historian, but sometimes the view of Latin America is really fixed on what happened in the first 10 years of the 21st century. And populism is much more than that. I mean, if we go, as I said, if you go to the 1990s, I mean, they were not really for inclusion, although there was a language of inclusion in someone like Menem. But these were neoliberal neoliberal policies. And this is the same party. And sometimes it's the same people. So, I mean, the question of opportunism also works. I mean, at this time, Christina Kirchner was a neoliberal, supporting the Menem government. Eventually, she became anti-neoliberal. And by the way, at this time, she presented herself as being against feminism. By the 2000 something, like she was, now anti-neoliberal and somehow closer to feminism, as she said. But still, I mean, I think we should also analyze the content. Because, for example, what is the position, and this is an interesting point, because I just listened to Correa recently, and they asked him, if your Congress, if you were the president, which is not, but if you were the president and Congress, including your party, votes in favor of abortion, will you veto? He said, of course. I mean, and he said, why? Because this is unnatural. I mean, and then you ask Christina Kirchner, she will tell you something similar. And then this is an issue which is ideological, how we deal with abortion. And I will say, I mean, then why don't we ask, Chavista intellectuals and politicians what they think about this? And so on and so forth. I mean, in Latin America, these supposedly very inclusive movements, they are all standing, for abortion and against, and basically sustaining very reactionary traditions in the continent. So my point is that there is sometimes, in my view, a stereotype of what Latin America is, which sadly is not, the reality. I mean, as I see it, I mean, and particularly historically, I mean, we had great moments and also terrible moments, and my job is not to celebrate Latin America. Now, when you focus on Europe, sometimes Latin America functions as a kind of wild type, as they say in science. But if you are, as a Latin American, I don't see that at all. Like in terms of exactly what is right and what is left, populism is always an amalgamation. I mean, it's very, even in, I think in most cases, but particularly in the case that I know the most, which is Peronism, I will not, the question of Peronism being inclusive, it depends on when and exactly what you focus on. I mean, by the 1970s, if we were saying stuff like we are saying, we might be killed as they release the street. I mean, there is a famous case of, a journalist asking a question to Peron, and she was killed the following day by this paramilitary unit. So the question is, what is exactly inclusive, what is exactly democratic? And this is the problem. So my point is that, sometimes there is an incredible analysis of the complexity of the European cases, but at the risk of presenting Latin America as a kind of caricature or thing that doesn't exist in reality. So, and this case, Latin America being this kind of macho culture situation, and the North being related to other traditions. And we don't see this, but even in Germany you don't see this. So my point is that, sometimes it's interesting because if you look at a kind of going back into what was written about populism in, 10 years ago, Germany is the country that this will never happen. This will never happen. And now we see that this, the second part, the main party of opposition is really close to fascism and is an extreme right-wing populist organization. So exactly, the question for me, at least in this conference, and I was really excited to come here, is to talk about, how this issue of considering the gender dimensions of populism help us understand what's going on here. Because, it's really interesting. And the question is, what is the relationship between this and abortion, for example? Which is, I think, is a question that exists in all these countries, Europe, Latin America, and what is the position of these populist parties? So we have, perhaps you guys would like to add, or whatever.
Well, I just
Go ahead.
maybe like taken from
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, just because you mentioned abortion now, and I was very much linked to Christianity. At least in the current discourse with Trump and his support base, do you think, and this I do think gets tied to gender because also on women's role on Christianity, do you see a direct link between religion and populism in the general, be it, especially I guess right-wing populism? Is that like a common I'm blanking on the word.
It's an important
Strategy,
question.
I guess, or point for silencing women again and removing their choice over their bodies.
Thank you very much for the presenters. Many questions, but I'll narrow to one, which is something that came up in the talks about the importance for the leader to be in quote-unquote direct contact with the people. And I think the directness of the contact has to do a lot with what kind of technological platforms are available for mass mediation of his or her image and those points of contact. I know, I believe radio, for example, was very important for Evita, television definitely for Hugo Chavez, Twitter for Trump.
And Chavez.
And Chavez, that's right. So I'm just wondering if you could address the question of not how media is just merely a platform or a stage for kind of populist performance, but how it also enables or disables, how it actually also shapes the kinds of, allows and, you know, for different kinds of experiences of quote-unquote directness, no, and of becoming a vessel for the people.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you for the panel. It was really interesting. Just something briefly about populism and gender, it caught my attention. About some public policies, like in Bolivia, the case of course, we know that the discourse of Evo is very machista, of course, but at the same time, there were some public policies that were very progressive, including abortion, delegalizing some cases of abortion, and also the thing about parliamentary gender parity for women, and Bolivia became, with Rwanda, like the top in the world. Like they had the same amount of men and women in the Congress, and that was very praised. But it was hard to implement, but it happened. You know, that's it's kind of, would you still call that as populism? But because I don't know if that was exactly a petition of the social movements, but it happened. You know, it's a reality. Thank you.
So in terms of the religion question, I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with it, but I guess populism as a logic that appropriates, you know, different elements as they work within that specific context. I guess it appropriates religion when it's proper, right? When it's appropriate to use it. So I guess, I mean, my experience is mostly with Venezuela, and the majority of the population is Catholic. So in that sense, it kind of evolved. The religion wasn't necessarily relevant. It actually, you know, Chavez, initially he pushed against religion. He antagonized the Catholic Church. Then he got sick, so, you know, people speculate that that's when he kind of had his miraculous conversion, and now he started, you know, working with the church. But I don't know. I mean, hopefully you can add a little bit more to that. But I think, at least from thinking about the concept of populism and how it appropriates certain ideologies, I would think that it appropriates religion in a similar way.
And this started with Peronism. I mean, that you know, someone like Mariano Plotkin, an historian of Peronism, says, well, I mean, the Peronism Peronized Christianism, but in a way it's interesting because it Peronized everything. Like, I mean, there was, for example, an Argentine Jewish institution which was closed, and then it was created an Argentine Jewish organization, because the idea is that you can be whatever you want, but you have to be Peronist. And which is the most important identity. Yeah. So, which brings the question, I mean, which is the possibility of a certain identity within, I mean, as long as you recognize, you know, number one, I mean, that's a possibility. It depends, I think, you know, it depends on the cases, the issue of religion, but there is a close link. I mean, in the case of Kirchnerismo, I mean, also there was first a kind of antagonism with the church. I mean, this led actually in Argentina to what I think probably is the, you know, I mean, at least I'm talking now as an Argentine citizen, probably the best thing that they did, which is to allow Congress to decide on a very important issue, which was same-sex marriage. And although the president was actually, no, I mean, it's not that she agreed with it necessarily, but she allowed, you know, Congress to function like a Congress, and everybody, you know, voted, and that was approved. But that was a context in which was not the typical, you know, generally we didn't have those kind of discussions in Parliament. With abortion, you know, it's something that is going on now. I mean, the neoliberal, you know, technocratic government that we have in Argentina now wants to have a discussion on abortion, although the president and his most important ministers are against. But Cristina Kirchner has not talked, because actually she agrees with President Macri on this. She's against abortion. And if this is, if we are talking about equality and the right for a person to decide on her body, I mean, this is a main issue here. And again, there are examples. I mean, the case of Bolivia is different. And again, I mean, it's very hard. I mean, it's very hard to homogenize here because we don't find that. Now, in my own view, I mean, the media thing, like, again, I'm doing publicity here, but I have a big section on that. But I don't know exactly, in terms of our meeting here, how that relates or whether there is a kind of particular dimension to that, which, which relates us to the topic at discussion. Like, I don't know, I would have to think about that. Now, the question, one of the issues here, and I think the issue of gender particularly brings this to the fore, is that there is a kind of, let me be blunt. Sometimes there is a laziness in the field to think this is right, this is left. And in fact, this actually shows, whether we are talking about a left or right position. And I think this is a marker, generally, which is this right to decide on whatever you want to do with your body. And this is, I think, I will claim this is a right-wing position, but many of these movements, particularly in Ecuador, in Argentina, which are generally identified as the left, are basically closer to Trump on this one, and perhaps to the right of Trump. So, this is a challenge. Yeah, so...
Let me start with the media. And try
so
to...
you want to talk about the media?
Yeah, but link it to gender and populism. Okay. Because I think it's very interesting how the radio was used by Evita to present herself, according to Marisa Navarro, as a virgin-like Mary figure, the intermediary between Perón and the shirtless one. And also how she used the radio to present politics as a soap opera based on love to Perón, based on love to the people and hatred to the oligarchy. And you can do the same type of analysis with television ads. For instance, the television ads that Bucaram had, which are horrible quality, but are very interesting because of the type of gender images and images of the people. They are based on the idea of proper masculinity and proper femininity. There was an ad that was very powerful in which there is a Mercedes-Benz going around, stopping in front of these women from a lower class background, and you can see that, and they lower the window and they hissle at her, they say something, and the woman responds, oligarchy Bucaram is coming here to defend us from predatory men like you. But, it was very interesting because Bucaram did not have real advisors on publicity, but the idea was that he and his movements were going to rescue the masculinity of poor men who cannot protect their women and the dignity of these women, at the same time that Bucaram was talking about the size of his genitals, etc. And I think that with Twitter, you see the same thing. The president in Latin America who used the most tweets was Correa, and he had all of these followers, but he never used Twitter in an interactive way. He was always giving orders, and those orders were based on attacks to the media and to his enemies with very gendered type of discourses. Talking in terms of religion, it's a fascinating topic in many ways. Populism always used religious images. Eva was the Virgin Mary, Velasco Ibarra and Aya de la Torre were like Jesus Christ. Chavez claimed to be the mixture between Bolivar and Jesus Christ. So, religion is always...
Trump is Trump.
Trump is Trump, he's beyond everything. So, religion is always there, and here comes the problem. That's where religion stops all of the demands, and I totally agree with you, on the autonomy of human beings, especially of women, in terms of the choice that they have with their bodies. And I think that the future in Latin America is very bleak if you look at religion, because what is happening in Costa Rica, I forgot the name of this minister, this Protestant minister, who's going to... Fabricio. He is running with a coalition between all of these popular classes that are fundamental Christians around the churches with the support of the Catholic Church. So you see a combination between the hierarchy of the church, popular based religious movements of Protestant origin, with an anti-feminist, anti-gay platform. And perhaps that's the future for this alliance against gender equality, gender ideology. And you see that all over the place. The Catholic Church is in a big war against what they call gender ideology, or the fallacies of gender ideology. And in terms of public policies, I mean, this idea of gender parity started before populism. I mean, that's something that I guess came with a recommendation of the United Nations, and Correa, Morales, and Chavez continue with that. But and of course, that's their ambiguity, right? At the same time that they denied many rights for women in terms of their cultural autonomy, they included gender parity, they included more presence of women in the public sphere. And in Bolivia, it's very interesting because they included working class peasant women, women that came especially from the Cocalero movement, in positions of authority. So again, the ambiguity of populism.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, to continue on that note, one thing that I don't know if we talked about it, but I feel like it needs to be brought up, is that, I mean, the roots of populism are democracy, right? And this was mentioned at the beginning. So all these leaders and parties are still operating within a context where they have to get elected or re-elected. So, I mean, I think this maybe puts it in the realm of a strategy, but thinking about, like, in terms of the issue of abortion, you know, some of these leaders in Latin America, you know, they grew up in a context where it might not be sanctioned that, you know, to have pro-choice attitudes, and also you're working with, you know, within a constituency that does not necessarily support that either, for the most part. So, and then again, looking at the European context, I think Sarah's paper is amazing. I mean, this idea of helping non-Western women, I think it complicates this the notion of inclusionary versus exclusionary, because now what we think about as European exclusionary populism, it's taking a completely different approach, and it's including certain groups that normally you wouldn't think they would be. But at the same time, Europe has a much longer and a much stronger history with gender equality. So at the same time, even though, you know, these parties might not be mainstream and they're not trying to cater to a certain mainstream electorate, they still have to function within a context where, you know, taking certain extreme positions towards gender equality might be sanctioned very harshly. So, I mean, again, I come back to the idea of context, but these parties and leaders are not operating in a vacuum. So in a way, they're still constrained. They don't have total discretion in terms of coming up with these ideas and policy. They still have to operate within, you know, what their constituents want.
I mean, I would say that in the case of Argentina, I'm not sure that is, exactly the situation. But then again, there is a tradition of considering the Catholic Church as a kind of power factor, perhaps more important than the people, ironically. So, I mean, there was a realignment after Father Bergoglio became the Pope in Argentina, and I even had my doubts that the same-sex marriage law would have been passed after this realignment, because Bergoglio, or Pope Francis as he's called now, he said that same-sex marriage law was the work of the devil, and at that point. And eventually now also he himself has changed that position. Now it's not the work of the devil, but he says that he's no one to judge. So anyway, so
but in a very populist
yes,
way.
Yes. So that even some people that led some people, not me, to talk about a populist pope. But but again, I think it's, you know, it's there are those considerations, but then there is the question of whether these politicians are ahead of the time, and this is sometimes what you want from politicians, right? That they present, you know, possibilities of advancement rather than reflecting on, you know, the most reactionary traditions of their peoples. But again, probably, but I think it's a good point, because in fact, probably because of that, it's hard to see this kind of programmatic politics in populism. I mean, there is no reason they should do that. That's a really important point, I think. Yeah, please. Go ahead. So,
Hi,
three.
I've been following you, Federico, from New School.
Okay.
I'm in the program on transdisciplinary design there. But I thank you for today's presentation, and I think it's very interesting what Sahar said about feminism and feminist, because I'm doing my thesis on populism and design. I'm populist by design. So I find very interesting how gender and performativity and empty signifiers plays a role in what you said of feminist and feminism, or I don't know. I mean, I think that there is a complexity there in the fluid gender that hasn't penetrated or hasn't helped, or populists cannot take fluid gender as a thing to build a movement. I don't know. I mean, there is something there that in empty signifiers that I think will be very interesting to explore. What are those empty signifiers? What a woman is in certain places, and what is the role of a woman in certain places? And I think that's maybe why it's difficult to find more women in populist movements.
Thank you to the three of you for all your insights, and to all of you who are participating. I'm thinking right now of Trump and of Evo Morales, and I'm thinking of their relationship to the party, structure in which they're inserted. Evo Morales got into the presidency with what was called an instrumento político, which is sort of like a halfway party, right? And in the process of entering the state, the consolidation of the party occurred, and the relationship between Evo and the party is a very complicated one, at least, right? And I just want you to look at it in terms of what is that dynamic, and what are the patriarchal logics that are, if you look at party building, they're there, but what are the patriarchal logics that sort of like shape this populist leader in this case? The same with Trump. Trump is sort of, the relationship of Trump with the Republican Party is a complicated one right now, to say the least, right? And I think there's something there that we could look at in terms of the way in which that emotional relation of the leader is set up with the people that they are supposedly representing, right? And yeah, is that okay? Is that enough?
So we have space for one more question. Can we take two? It's okay. Yeah, okay. Please, please. Yes, and then.
Hello. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. Because the topic for me is very sort of contradictory, because of what you said. The people is seen as one unity, and how can gender be? But that also gives the tension of the topic, because, for instance, Trump speaks of very, for me, language that I would never make me vote for him, but still a lot of women did. So do you have an explanation for that? I'm very curious to know that. And another one is, I'm from the Netherlands, and there's two populist politicians who use sort of seductive techniques to make people fall in love with them, women, and I also am curious what you think about that.
Yes, and there is a space. You have one. Yes. You have yes. You have no. Oh, okay. Oh, someone. Please go ahead. Oh, I thought you had.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, this is more a question of how do, and for all of you actually, how do you see the generational dimension playing out in Latin America? I know that here in the U.S., um, it's funny. I was listening to Hillary Clinton's publicity person talking on the radio this morning, and they asked her, well, how come, you know, when you were running against Sanders, you guys you got less than half of the millennial generation, you know, of millennial women, and she didn't answer it. But I'd like to, get a sense from you guys what you think, about the generations coming up, because I think, at least in this country, I think we're on the cusp of some changes, possibly.
Yes, I mean, here, I mean, I will defer to my colleagues. I mean, from what I know regarding this last question is that there are different situations in places like, I think in places like Italy and also Argentina, unlike in the US, I mean, younger generations were voting for populist candidates, whereas in the US is the opposite, probably the opposite for the Brexit movement in Britain. But I would like to emphasize this idea that this is a history, because I mean, in the case of Argentina, Peronism has been many things, and and I have this quote from a Peronist, classic Peronist in the minister eventually of Perón from the 1940s, and he said, "The Peronist is a person with a defined sex." Okay, so that's. But and then, I mean, from that to same-sex marriage approved by the Peronist Party is a long history. And it's hard to know what is going to happen. And again, I mean, I think history shows us that it can be many things. And we are seeing one chapter. And we have in my view, we have this privilege to know the previous chapters, but certainly not the next ones. And again, in terms of this issue of the party, in many cases, what I have seen, studying different historical cases, that there is, this might not be the case of the current president in the U.S., but in other cases they were able to replace people that were or had like a kind of more independence within this party. Eventually, they were being replaced by people that were closer to the leader. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, so far, actually, I mean, if you analyze the American situation, I don't even know whether Trump should do that, because they are quite obedient, and it's incredible how how the Republican Party has turned into the party of Trump. Now we will see what happens if they lose elections, whether they remain the party of Trump. But it's quite surprising. He might not need to do this. Perón himself replaced a lot of people that originally they were kind of equals, and he didn't like that. But with Trump, I mean, they are very much obedient, I think.
Yeah, so I wanted to answer the question about reconciling, female vote for Trump, and I think this is actually a really puzzling issue. Besides populism and Latin America, I actually study U.S. politics too. So,
That's great.
yeah, just in time, I started studying American politics. But actually, there is. So one of the studies that I actually quote in the chapter, it's from the Patterns of British Journal. Harderville, they did a study at the European level, and one of the things that they found in terms of the gender gap is that women and men assign different considerations when they're judging who to vote for. So I think, and that resonates with some of the literature in the American politics, and I honestly don't remember the author's name right now, but there are a couple of studies that basically find that voters in general, and in this case women, just kind of shut down certain aspects of what the candidate is talking about, and they just favor the things that they matter to them. So it's kind of like some sort of way of dissociating with some of the ugly aspects of the candidates, so you can actually continue to vote for them, because there are some aspects of their discourse that resonates with you. So I don't think that's necessarily gender-driven because it's, I think it's just voter-driven in general. But some authors actually use that to kind of explain, how there were women actually voting for Trump when he was, being so, I don't want to use the word for it, but anyway, it wasn't, it was kind of against women in certain aspects. So, and also, I think about the generational shift. I mean, one of the things that I found in studying like the relationship with gender and populism is that the issues that were taken by populist leaders or that they were addressed by populist leaders evolved kind of simultaneously with the waves of feminism. So initially, for instance, at least in Latin America, let's restrict it to that, it was mainly the right to vote, and they appropriated that. Then, in the second and third wave, they started appropriating issues like the right to work and certain, work conditions, to the point where now we have populist leaders, or at least populist parties that were based, like the Peronist Party, they're supporting things like same-sex marriage. So I think, in terms of generational shift, populism or not, I think to a certain extent, we think of leaders as able to in a certain way, especially when it comes to populism, to do kind of whatever they want, but at the end of the day, they are still restricted by their constituents because of this kind of democratic basis for populism.
Well, let's start with the question on populism by design. And you asked the question, what a woman is. The leader defines what a woman is. That's what populism is all about, is the leader appropriating the voice of the people, and the people is presented as a unitary actor, as an homogeneous actor, as the people as one, and the leader is the one who defines that, and whoever doesn't fit into how they present a woman, they are women who are not really Argentinian because they are feminists, or they are not, or gender ideologies do not have any place in Ecuador for Correa. In terms of Pamela's question, in terms of party politics, it's very interesting that in places in where you have conflicts, in places where you have conflicts between the opposition and the populist movement and populist leader, you have more of an emphasis in building parties. For instance, the opposition to Perón was based on his economic, his social policies, his political policies. In the case of Ecuador, with Velasco Ibarra, the opposition was only political, and they did not have the need to create social organizations or strong political parties. But now the populist parties tend to be personalistic, and the leader tends to impose himself, because he's mostly a guy, as the embodiment of the people and of the party. But at the same time, you have all of these emotional elements, but everything is subordinated to the figure of the leader. This contradiction between unity and diversity of the people, you were pointed to that, Sahara, I think, and there was your question also, how the people as a unity can be gendered, but the people is never, that's the contradiction of populism. The people is one, but at the same time they have different gender projects, and they have different images of masculinity and femininity. Why did people vote for Trump? For me, the best response to that is this book, Strangers in Their Own Land, but by a sociologist who studied the Tea Party in Louisiana, in a place where you have a lot of pollution, and these people who live in all of these polluted areas were activists and members of the Tea Party, and then later on they became the source of Trumpism. And it's people who are voting against their own interests, and we know that domination works like that. But it's very interesting how she describes the reason why women and men who are poor and disfranchised start to look at somebody like Trump as somebody who will defend their interests. And in terms of generation, it's very interesting that in Latin America, at least in the Bolivarian populism, it was the young who were behind them. It was the young who were behind Chavez, who were behind Correa, who were behind Morales, because, and here is because they came with forward-looking proposals. They wanted to improve democracy. They didn't do that, but they wanted to improve democracy. They wanted to include excluded. And they were and they wanted to do a revolution. I mean, what is fascinating about that wave of populism in Latin America is that the term revolution that was forgotten came alive again, and they changed the strategy. The strategy was not going to the mountains and using armed struggle, was using the boat and not bullets. So I think that all of those rhetorical elements and the need for change, that's why they came to power, because they were a reaction. I mean, they came to power as a reaction against neoliberalism, and they came with all of this popular mobilization, so the youth were an important part of that.
Well, one thing I would like to add is that, I mean, one important issue is the question of what happens to political culture in a the political culture of a country, of a given country, which supports this kind of populist candidates. Because of course, these people might feel representing Trump. They might even, close themselves, turn off themselves to certain aspects of Trump, of Trumpism. But those certain aspects include racism and very serious forms of discrimination. So you might ask, what kind of people vote for a candidate? What kind of people decide to close their eyes or even ignore racism? I mean, these are serious issues, because, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, this is, now I will talk as a citizen of, of many places. I would say that this is, as from a citizen perspective, which is the perspective of, how democracy can be enlarged rather than diminished. This is very depressing. Because what you have is people that believe that they can be represented by a racist. I mean, that's exactly what's going on here. So he might talk to them in many ways, but they also prefer to ignore racism. So what kind of person decides to ignore racism? And then the question that we should ask is how racist that person is. Because if you can be neutral towards racism and discrimination in certain ways, then in that sense, I mean, I would say at best that will be a soft form of racism. Anyway, so go ahead.
So, I just wanted to add, like, in terms of the question of femininity versus feminism, this is again, you have Ivanka Trump, right? You said that, a woman is what the leader decides it is. In this case, now you have women who are middle class or lower income that are voting for a candidate that projects or what a woman is or what gender should be in terms of something that's completely alien to that. In terms of femininity, in terms of background. So again, you see again I think as a citizen and also as someone who studies this, it's very troubling.
Yes, I think, I mean, that's why, I mean, I think here Bourdieu's notions of symbolic violence are very important, because this is incorporating violence to the self by just either ignoring it or even condoning it. I mean, because, I mean, I don't want to engage with this sense of false consciousness, but I think it's part of it.
But I think that what Trump did, he was able to politicize racism, white fears to a changing multicultural society. He was able to politicize sexism. I mean, the proper role of women is to go back to whatever his image of the 1950s is. And homophobia, it's a total reactionary construction of what and who the people are, which is backward-looking, in anti-enlightenment, and perhaps that's what explains the appeal, because the moment in which you politicize white identity in that particular way, and of course Trump might fail in his project, I hope, but the problem is that the identity was already politicized, and you can have somebody that is not so crazy or so insane with Twitter who might be able to carry that project, in a better way than he has done. But I think that the damage of Trumpism is huge. I live in Kentucky, and you can feel that in everyday interactions. I mean, you can feel that when Latinos have to go to the supermarket in big groups because they are afraid of being attacked or being told, why are you talking in Spanish? They are in constant fear of having to show your papers. Now, I always travel with all of my immigration papers because otherwise I will be deported. So, and this idea of making sexism in the most vulgar way of sexism and homophobia normal again, it's horrible. And I don't know how many years it will take to heal that.
Yes.
Because it was a project, I mean, it was all of the movements since the 1960s, all of the progress, I hate to use the word progress, of the advantages, all of the rights that people conquer that are being taken away now by voting.
Okay, well.
In that depressive note.
On that note, well, thank you very much for being here and for the dialogue and the questions. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. We have a little reception outside. Keep on the dialogues about gender and populism. Gracias.
Thanks so much.
No, ojalá fuera toda la semana. Ojalá que fuera todas las semanas.
Un placer, realmente, muy lindo. Y me gusta mucho el formato.
Yeah, sí, mejoró mucho.
También, sí.
La gente está muy engaged.
Sí, muy bueno todo el formato, las preguntas, la verdad que el formato es muy buena idea porque hace que la gente también participe más. Luego, en cambio, si tenés 3 personas hablando, yo que sé, media hora cada uno, y no es lo mismo.
Sí, que haya diálogo. Sí, todo muy bien.
Es muy orgánico.
Sí.
Uno siempre quiere que eso pase.
Pero a veces no pasa.
A veces no pasa.
Mike no ha preguntado nada. No han preguntado nada, Mike.
Gracias, no, gracias por todo.
Por jugar fútbol.
Oh, a mí me pasó hace unos meses. Me rompieron la pata.
¿Así?
Pasaremos entonces a la recepción.
Perfecto.
Muchas gracias por su tiempo.
No.
I will check. I will check now. But
Did you tell him that?
Muy buen el ensayo. Tenía que lo tenía para leer unos meses. Lo leí antes.
oh, that's true. Okay. No, en realidad es un proyecto bastante interesante. Yo realmente no estudié. It's not my.
You got it. You got it.
So I kind of like.
I just want to sit down, you know.
Pasan más porque hablas con la gente.
Oh no, you're good, man.